Well, this morning we continue in Genesis, and we'll stay in this part of Genesis until about the end of this month, maybe early October, and then we're going to switch over. I'm going to read. I don't know if you've ever read it before. Peter's second epistle, 2 Peter. It's just the bomb, as they used to say. It's really an astonishing little letter. So we're gonna look at that when we finish this front into Genesis in just a couple of weeks or so. But as we finish off Genesis 1 through 11. We have come out of creation and the creation of man, and we've come through the flood. Yay. And so, and today we're going to finish the flood. So that's why we have that up here today. In sort of an astonishing way. And when I look at Genesis, I always envision myself finding some nice space of time, sitting down in an overstuffed chair, having a warm drink in my hand, and just slowly going through it and going, that's interesting. And just think slowly about it, which is something we don't do. We normally just crash through stuff, and then I get a text, and then I hear my phone ring, and then something else happens, and you just don't really dwell. So this is an exercise in dwelling and asking questions as you dwell. And I think you'll see that it helps us in terms of understanding what it is God's trying to tell us in this first section of Genesis, which is so incredibly valuable. For everything, it turns out. It's without overstating, it really is the foundation of the entire Bible. And without these first 11 chapters, you miss the whole reason why we need to be rescued, why Jesus came. I mean, everything falls apart without these. So that's why we're here, and we're going to continue that on today. Let me just pick up where we were. See, this is the outline of all of Genesis 1 through 11, the creation, the fall, the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. And so we are still kind of at the tail end of the flood right now. So let's wrap up the flood today and get dried off, and we'll see where we go. Last week, we were at this. This is actually a picture of a carved stone in Upper Israel that has been carved. You see how it has sort of like a point on every corner? It's kind of square. That's an altar. Altars back during that time traditionally had horns on the corners. That's what they call those things, those tips on the edges. This one's up in the Samaria part of Upper Israel, where they were not supposed to be doing altars, but this is found just sitting out on the dirt. This was done. Well, it turns out that after the flood last week, an astonishing thing happened. When Noah and his family came out, the first thing they did was they built an altar, and they had sacrifices, and they thanked God for bringing them through the flood. And this is God's response to that. This is still last week. This is chapter 8, verse 21. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I've done. So even despite the fact that man's heart, his intention, which is his imagination, is evil, still God promises right here at the end of chapter 8 that he won't do it as he's done it before, that is with the flood. And then he goes on and he says, just to kind of reaffirm for us, while the earth remains, and it remains today, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, all those shall not cease. So this is the beginning of a promise that God is making to Noah as he's coming out of the ark, is the fact that as long as the earth remains, these things will be rock solid and will never change. He'll never change those things. It's a promise to us. So today, find your exits. We're leaving the ark. So this is now life after the ark, and we're in Genesis 9, and God describes for him what's going to go on now that you've left the exits of the ark. So this is where we pick up today new, chapter 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Yada, 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 yada. Verse 7, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. So why did I stick the yada yadas in there? Not because we're not going to read them, we will in a second, but to show you there's a symmetry right here. Notice God blesses Noah and his family, and the way he blesses them is he says, be fruitful and multiply, stuff, yada, yada, and then at the end, be fruitful and multiply. That's the blessing. And so that's a fascinating thing. Does that ring any bells for you, you Bible scholars who've been studying Genesis ever since the beginning of the summer? It should be reminiscent of this. Genesis 1. He said to Adam and Eve, he created man in his image, his own image. In the image of God, he created him, man and female. He created them, and God blessed them. See, there it is. Blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So there is a fundamental blessing that God has designed into the way we're created, that in multiplying and filling the earth, it's a great blessing. I see people going, is it? If you've raised kids, you're saying, is it? Well, it is. It is. I mean, that's something, God could have made us like amoeba. You know how amoeba reproduce? They kind of go, they squish a little piece off their sides, and it lives. And it's just no fun at all for an amoeba, I think. I've never talked to an amoeba. But the whole process, God says, I don't want you to multiply and divide that way. I want you to really enjoy the whole process. I'm allowing you to be intimately involved in the reproduction that creates more people. That's a blessing to you. And if you've ever been involved in that as a child or as a parent, you know what I'm talking about. It really is a great blessing in that sense. And that's part of our design, is to do that, is to populate. So even though we have come past the flood, where God said mankind is corrupt and he's only imagining evil all the time, even still, I will continue this blessing which I've built in from the very beginning, that you repopulate the earth. And that's a great blessing. Now, here's a little thing I had to throw in as an aside. Do you know what the fertility rate is when they measure fertility rates in cultures? It's the number of children every woman has to have in that culture for the culture to remain flat in population. So you can kind of think of this. Every woman has to probably have about 2 kids, because there's male and females. And if every woman has 2 kids, then the population stays sort of flat. When you factor in the fact that there's deaths and stuff like that, it gets to be a little higher, 2.1, 2.2, something like that. And that's the average. If you're above that, then your population is going to grow as a country. If it's below that, your population is going to diminish every generation. And top of the list right here, we have Niger. They have 7.03 children per woman. So that country is going to grow a lot as every generation goes on. Another one right here, India is 2.55. So India is going to continue to grow because every woman before she dies has 2.5 children. Well, statistically speaking, right? 2.5 children. Well, the post-Christian Western countries, France is going to be it's going to be shrinking. The United States is going to be right behind it, shrinking as well, just slightly. The UK, 1.9, they're going to shrink. Sweden, 1.6 is going to shrink. Canada is going to shrink. Germany is going to shrink. Italy is going to shrink. Japan's really going to shrink. So this whole idea about the blessing of, multiplying and repopulating, these post-Christian cultures have said, yeah, we just don't want to have any part of that, really. We're just going to shrink. And so it's an interesting thing. There is a correlation worldwide when you look at cultures who have been largely Christian, largely biblical, who have now rejected that. At the same time that they've rejected biblical Christianity, their reproduction rates have gone down. Very interesting. That's a little side for you. Okay, so be fruitful and multiply. That's part of the blessing from God by our design as human beings. Now let's look at the yada, yada, yada section in there. And this is where I always like to ask, what would you put between that first line in verse 1 and the last line in verse 7 for a blessing? And what would you write in the Bible? I would write something like, to Noah, I'd write, be fruitful and multiply. And let's see, life will be easy for you. You can just pick fruit off the trees. You're a good man, so I'll make sure things are good for you and easy for you and there'll be justice for you. There are bad people, I'll make sure that they get judged and that's bad. Something like that, right? Because what you're wanting to do is bless Noah and his family for coming out. So what does he say? Well, let's take a look. Here's what he says. This is yada number 1 of 3, and it's in verse 2. This is a blessing, part of the blessing. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. Blessing or curse? So basically what he's saying is that the animals, they see you, they're going to turn tail and run because they're afraid of you now. They're just going to be totally, totally afraid of you. Which, after all, if they're big animals, that's a good thing, right? But it's not a totally good thing. God is not only blessing them in terms of repopulating, but he's telling them what the ground rules are going to be in this new society. And something is going to switch now. And what's going to switch is the animals who used to be, back in the Garden of Eden time, used to be very friendly. It used to be, you are Lord of them, but there wasn't this horrible kind of attacking, violent thing. But now, the animals are going to be scared of you. What is it about man that it's going to make all the animals scared of you all of a sudden? But before we look at that, look at this. You remember this back in Genesis 1? This is sort of part of the original plan. Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So the contrast from that time, which is Eden, to now, which is deeply fallen, is the fact that not only is man going to be ruling over the animals back in chapter 1, but it's not going to be a friendly rulership. Now the animals are going to fear and be terrorized by man. Something has tragically broken in the relationship. What was once a beneficial kind of watching over is now terrified from the animals. This is part of what we talked about before, where something in the creation itself, even in the animal world, slipped at the fall. Something went with the fall. And part of this is what God is saying. What went with the fall? It's still true. I want you to be Lord over those animals, but now they'll be terrified of you. They'll live in fear of you all the time, which for us sounds good. But from God's plan, it doesn't sound good. In fact, if you fast forward way to the end of the Bible and you look at what it's going to be like in heaven and afterwards, even when we're living on the earth, post when Jesus comes back, remember that part about the lion and the lamb lying down together? So something will be fixed in the relationships of the animals, and there will be no fear of us as well. So there really is something that has happened across the animal kingdom as a result of man's fall. And here's part of it. God says they're going to be terrified of you, and they're going to run from you all the time. It also implies the way he has this, not that this is just going to be so one-sided, but actually it's going to be two-sided. Man will fear animals, and animals will fear man, and they will actually be at war now in a real sense, at war. And that's why the fear is there. It's this violence that's going on. But there's another reason why this is going to happen, and it comes up in the second yada right here. It comes in verse 3. Every moving thing that's alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. So up till this point, mankind has been vegan. And now, steakins. Yeah. So up to this point, really, if you remember back in Genesis 1, God said, here's all these plants. Eat these are made for you. But now, you can actually eat the animals, which might add a reason for why the animals are now scared of man. See, that's how it kind of fits together. Every moving thing that's alive shall be food for you, which, by the way, includes unclean and clean animals at this point. Remember, he talked about that earlier. This is a teaching moment from this point on. Because what God wants mankind to remember is that something must lose its life in order for you to live. It'll be a constant reminder that this thing which was once alive died to keep you alive. That's a hint way forward to the fact, even when you get into Israel later on, the whole temple there in Israel is built for the whole purpose of dealing with people's sin. And what is it that went on at the temple to deal with people's sin? Things died. Ritually and for real, they died. And God put together a pretty specific program about what had to die for what you did. But really, there's no way you could come to the temple and then leave the temple without getting through your thick skull during Israel that because of my sin, something must die to take care of it. And even pre-temple in Israel, something must die in order to keep you alive. So this is a theme that goes on all the way through the Bible, that somehow, because of the fall, because of who we are, we have lost our life because of that. And if we want to live, something else must die in our place. And if you fast forward all the way to the New Testament, that something else is Jesus. So all of these things build to point to this one who will come and rescue us from our own sin. But this was just a mild reminder. Something's going to have to die for you to stay alive. Ooh. Something must lose its life. And then the third yada of all those yadas in between, the populate blessings, verse 4, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely I will require your lifeblood from every beast, I will require it, and from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. So, okay, wait, back up. What's he saying? Verse 4, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So when you do kill and eat an animal, no blood in it. You have to drain the blood out of it. And later on we see why, and actually it starts to do it here. Because symbolically the blood is a reflection of the fact that God has given life to this thing. And that life comes from God. You are not to consume that life, but you can consume the animal. So even when you get to ritual Israel and they're eating animals, the first thing they do after they kill it is they bleed it. And it's illegal in Jewish law to eat that blood. So you have to make sure that the animal has no blood left. And it starts right here. Now, he amplifies this a little bit with mankind as well. He says, not only is the blood in the animals sacred in that sense, and you're not supposed to eat that blood because that's life from God, but man, the blood in man, even more sacred in that sense. And he says it right here, verse 5. I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. So on the one hand, remember we talked about the problems with the animals? What if an animal like a giant bear, this beast, comes and it attacks you and it kills you and you're dead? God says right here, I will demand from that animal your lifeblood because that's wrong. You can't take life in that sense. I'm going to even demand that of animals. Justice for animals that kill men and spill his blood. What? Yeah. Because the blood symbolically is the life given by God, and that's sacred. God can take it, God can give it. That's not our job. We don't touch that. But even if an animal attacks and takes the blood of man, that animal is going to have to pay. That's how precious it is. And then he goes on, that's animals killing men, but after that, and from every man's brother, I'll require the life of man. So if man kills man and basically deprives him of the life, that is the blood of that man, I'm going to hold the person who killed him responsible. I'm taking his life. That's how sacred this is. So he's really pointing to the fact that God is the one in creation who's made all these living creatures, and God alone has given them life, symbolically in that blood that pumps through. God has given them that life. And even though man's thoughts and intentions from his youth are evil, you will not kill. You will not take the life of man. Even though he's incredibly evil, you will not take it. Because I'm the one that gives life. I'm the one that takes it away. That's my job, God's saying. So here's Noah and his family going out into a new culture, newly populated by his family. But we'll see next week, it doesn't go great, and it goes downhill all over again. It gets nasty and horrible all over again. This time, God has decided not to wipe everything up with a flood, but the society isn't great. It gets worse, is what it does. And God's saying, even as society gets worse and man does not turn from this invention of evil that he's born with from his youth, you will not spill his blood because he's precious to me and the life I gave him is my life I gave him. Now, we could spend a whole lot of time right here saying, well, excuse me, does that mean we're pro or con capital punishment? Yeah, I know. It's like, well, okay, I'm confused. Not supposed to spill blood, but I'm supposed to spill blood. God demands it. Well, without being able to explain it fully right now, I'll go this far. I'll say this gives enough support on that last line that capital punishment is okay. But it also, from other passages, as we put it together, we understand that the taking of life, if it's not on God's behalf, if it's something personal, that's wrong. So there is some sense later on in Israel, we see it, you can see it in the nation of Israel, that capital punishment is okay as long as what's happening is the people taking the lives are doing it as God's agents, because God alone can take that life. So we'll see it as we go along. Okay, let me just push on. He says it in kind of a little poem right after this, verse 6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. So there's just something still, even in his fallen state, that's very sacred about the life given to man, that you just won't mess with it. Just won't mess with it. Yeah, Dan.
Jim, would that provision have been the beginning of where a wolf or a bear or a lion kills a human being that would put that animal down?
Yes. In fact, in Israel, that's exactly what happened. If a wild animal would kill a man, you always take the animal out. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's where it comes from, right there. So God's just being very specific. And I'll just say this one last time. Mankind isn't going to get nicer. It's going to get worse. And as it gets worse, that can't give you reason to selfishly kill one another, because the life that's in man is still sacred and comes from God. And that life cannot be taken unless you're acting as God's agent who wants to have it taken. If you take it for your own purposes, no, you don't do that. If you take someone else's life for your life, then God says, I'll take your life as a result. That's how serious it is. This is like the foundation for almost all of government that comes on after this point. Even though man is twisted and sick and depraved, his life is still sacred to God. The sacredness of life itself comes from here and builds all the way through the Bible. Almost despite the twistedness of mankind, God still looks at man and loves him and honors and respects the life that he's given him. God still has an investment in mankind, even though the intents of his heart from day to night is evil. Go figure. And he'll demonstrate more and more as we go on the passage, you'll see. Okay, those are the three yadas in between. And this is one last teaching that's kind of an ongoing teaching moment for man. Man may be evil, but life is still sacred. Okay? So don't get that out of your head. Because man is made in God's image, there's something sacred about that life that's there. So, let's push on. Verse 8. So then God spoke to Noah and said to his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you. And by the way, when you see covenant, just think promise. That's all it is. My promise with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, and the birds and the cattle and every beast of the earth with you, all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. So now God's going to make a promise, and that promise is, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off. That's really the Hebrew for die. Be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. So now that they're disembarking on the wing exits and the rear exits of the plane, now as they're disembarking, the new world that's going to come out is basically this. And he says, I promise that I will no longer wipe out mankind with a flood. That's my promise to you. It won't happen again. Now, it's not to mean because man has gotten more holy or God has become more tolerant. He's just saying that while this whole community on the earth is repopulating through Noah and his sons, I want to let you know that things are going to be pretty consistent on the earth. As long as the earth is here, you'll have day and night, you'll have summer and winter, have all these things. That'll be consistent. You won't be able to blame the depravity of man on the inconsistency of creation. It's going to be very consistent, and from God's perspective, it's not going to be messed with. It's going to be very hospitable for mankind. That's not my fault, says God. I'm going to bless man that way, even though the depravity of man will continue to go downhill. So really, we start to see the unveiling of what's called general grace in that sense, where God says, I'm going to give to mankind, I'm going to allow him to live on this place that I've made, and even though in his depravity it's going to get worse and worse and worse, I'm not going to retract my hospitality of this place. I'm going to let it stay consistent. Not because man has earned it, or again, like because God's become more tolerant, but because there's something about God and his faithfulness to make it straight and even. Mankind can depend on this, even though mankind is going to go down. And this is where he's saying it. I'll never flood you again. I'll never flood you again to take you out. But the next time it rains, everyone on earth is going to be cowering and go, uh-oh, here it comes. Ah! So how does God counteract the knee-jerk reaction that mankind's going to have the next time it rains? Is this another big one? Is this going to be 40 days of rain again? Is God going to wipe us out? Well, I heard God promise he's never going to do that again. Well, I heard I might not either, but it's raining outside. It's been doing it for a week and a half. I mean, what's going to happen to us? Ah! See, rain is going to be so associated with the judgment of God that you got to do something to calm man down. By the way, I don't know if I ever mentioned this, but throughout all the cultures of the world, do you know that almost all of them have a very sizable flood myth in their histories? Almost every culture has some kind of knowledge about a flood that was huge and killed mankind. Now, many aspects of these myths in the different cultures get kind of screwball, but they all have some sense, some kind of cultural remembrance of the fact that at one time mankind was judged with water. And it's there. I mean, it's just remarkable. A lot of critics of the Bible will say, well, yeah, see, that's been there so long that the guys who wrote the Bible, they copied them from all those myths that you have in all those cultures. But you can't prove that. Which one came first? The biblical, real story, or all the myths? And so you can actually track that, it turns out. But anyway, they have a knowledge of this. So what do you do the next time it rains? God decides, I'll help you through that. So God says, okay, this is the sign of the covenant which I'm making between me and every living creature that's with you for all successive generations. I'll set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. So God always does this in his covenants as you go through the Old Testament. You see him saying, this is my promise, and that should be enough, just my words. But just so you don't forget my words, I'm going to give you a sign. It happened with Abraham and circumcision. There was a promise, there was a sign. So the signs just come, and I could name them as they go through the Old Testament. There's always this sign is there because we are forgetful. And even when in the midst of a good, week-long downpour, it would be nice to have some kind of assurance that this isn't going to kill us. So God says, let's have a sign. So here's the sign. The sign itself is just a touch point to remember what the promise is. And so he says, here's my touch point. I'm going to do this bow in the cloud, and it's going to be a sign. Well, this bow in the cloud, by the way, that phrase is ominous. Dun, dun, dun. Ominous. What was one of the most powerful weapons of the time? A bow. You mean God, instead of flooding us out, is going to hover over us with a bow, getting ready to aim at us? I mean, no kidding. This is kind of the imagery. It's not the imagery when you see those little cherubims, those little fat little babies with the angels and the wings, and they're flying over clouds, and they have no, not that. I'm talking about this imagery brings this idea militaristically of the fact that God has a bow in the clouds pointed at us. And this is how this would be interpreted right here. Just like this. This guy's got this bow, and if you're within, a couple tens of yards from this guy, it's lethal. A bow is a lethal thing. The flood was a lethal thing. So what God does is he takes this symbol of lethality and he turns it. He turns it is what he does. And he makes the bow aim up into the air. In the position that makes the bow not lethal. So really, in an ancient warfare picture, he's saying this bow, which used to be a powerful weapon for destruction, is now aimed up into the sky. It's not aimed at you. It's not aimed at you. So this picture connection right here was not lost on ancient peoples who read about this. They'd see this bow and say, that's just like the bow that I can be killed by. But the bow from God is not pointing at me anymore. So there really is a symbolic part of peace with a bow turned up into the air. That's what he's talking about here. So what's this bow? Well, it shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud, and I'll remember my covenant. And remember doesn't mean remember. It means to mark. It means to say, that's right, I've never forgotten. This covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. So God says not only will it be a sign for you so you'll remember, but God says I'll look at it and I'll remember. I'll make a mark. I remember saying I'm not going to do this, and that bow is what reminds me that I'm not going to do this anymore. And it should be your assurance as well. So when the bow is in the cloud, then I'll look upon it to remember, to mark the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, it's a real picture, by the way, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. That's the sign right there. And so when it starts to rain, instead of cowering in the bushes and saying, uh-oh, we're all going to die, instead you can say, wait, rainbow, we're not. Because God sees that, he remembers not to make this flood kill us. We see that, we remember the covenant God made, we understand the promise. And the rainbow in the midst of rain is a reassurance that this is not judgment, it's something else. And that's what the rainbow is for. It's to remind us. And so everyone goes, phew, we're not going to die. But still, to this very day, there's something about rain. And, we saw there's been floods through the country, through Colorado just recently. The great tsunami that happened in Indonesia back in, when was that, 2004, 5, something like that. Still, it seems like water is a scary thing, can be a scary thing. I remember when we were in Hawaii eons ago, before we had children, someone taught me how to body surf, without a board, how you get out there and you get far enough out there and you just kind of lean over and get stiff like this, and your body becomes the surfboard and you go in. Well, I'm very nearsighted, so I didn't have my glasses on at the time. And when you're out there in the water, you're always looking out in the deep end, deep end, the ocean. You're always looking out there to see if that horizon is coming up, to see if a big wave is coming, because the horizon just starts to rise like this. And I remember being out there one time, kind of going like this and squinting, and the horizon started to go up. I thought, this will be a good one. And it kept going up. This is going to be a really good one. And then all of a sudden, it got kind of scary, because it was really getting big. Sometimes the multiples of the waves there would do that. Every now and then, it's a big one. And then suddenly, instead of being, this is going to be really fun, your heart just kind of, and you go, I'm going to die. So you don't really know whether, should I swim toward shore as fast as possible, or should I swim toward the wave and get past it before it breaks? And so I swam toward the wave, hoping I'd get past it before it broke, but it broke on top of me. But there is something even to this day, that if you're in the midst of a large body of water, it can be terrifying. So when it starts to rain, there's this duality that goes on. And this is sort of what I wanted us to leave with, because previously water was a portend of this, inescapable justice. You know, when mankind saw this water coming and saw it piling up, and then so many died except for Noah and his family, that kind of rain meant inescapable justice. But, and this is where you sit back in your armchair and you think for a second and say, but wait a second, rain. Was rain always an idea of inescapable justice in the Old Testament? No, in fact, the opposite. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. Rain also is a sign of unmerited love. And I'll explain this for a second here, because what God is saying quite obviously in the symbolism here is this rain that comes from heaven, yes, indeed, God provides it. This rain that comes from heaven can have one of two purposes in your life. It can either bring inescapable justice, terrifyingly so, or it can bring unmerited love. And then why those two things? Because we have a God who is extraordinarily just and extraordinarily loving at the same time. And in this dualism, he's trying to teach us that God is not only just the gushy, loving, infinitely patient kind of God. He is very loving, but there is an issue of justice as well. And the same essence that comes from God can be used either way. God is both of those things and not just one or the other. Let me show you a few passages if you don't really believe what I'm saying. If you go to Proverbs, ladies, you're going to be in Proverbs. This is an awesome verse. Look at this. The king's wrath is like the roaring of a lion, but his favor is like dew on the grass. Now think powerful, powerful king. Think King of kings and Lord of lords. If you invoke his wrath, look out. It's going to be worse than a roaring lion. Terrifying, knees weak, the entire thing. But if that same king who is so absolute in his justice is loving towards you, it's as wonderful as dew on the grass. Dew is like invisible rain. Dew, as you go through the rest of the Old Testament, dew is the best precipitation in the world. Why? You go to sleep at night. You don't have to set any sprinklers for your grass or something. You go to sleep at night, and in the morning you wake up and you didn't hear it rain, but there's dew over everything. It's like the gentlest and most kind sort of precipitation, and plants will grow because of this dew. He's saying, you invoke the wrath of the king, it's like a lion. But his favor, it's like dew. It's like careful, gentle, thoughtful kindness to you. And this is where we're coming from. I'll show you a couple more. In the same sense, rain, inescapable justice, or unmerited love. See, he's coming here for unmerited love. And you got to remember, too, that when you look at these passages in the Old Testament, Israel is a lot like Utah. It's dry and rocky. Okay, it's dry and rocky. There's a few places where there's some water, but not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. And in fact, God told the nation of Israel, just to make a point to the nations about how my kindness can be like dew, I don't want you guys to set up your cities next to the mouths of large rivers, like they do in Egypt, the Great Nile River. Everyone lives right around that big delta plain that floods every year, you know? No, I want you instead to live up on the top of these rocky mountains. And if you ever get any water, it's because I gave it to you. I want it to be a testimony to my daily loving kindness and gentleness for you. Live up here and show the nations you can rely on me to water your plants. It's the unmerited favor and love of God. That's what this new precipitation is supposed to figure, not just the old inescapable justice. He goes on. Look at this. Leviticus 26. If you walk in my statutes, he's talking to Israel, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in their season. Yeah, from me. So that the land will yield its produce and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. So when the rains come instead of cowering in the bushes and saying, well, I'm going to die, you say, look at the kindness of God. Is this the same God as Genesis when he flooded the earth? Yeah, it's the same God. Inescapable justice, unmerited love. Rain is the picture. He does it again. Look at this. Hosea 14, one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible, about Israel being nasty. He says, I'll heal their apostasy. I'll love them freely. For my anger has turned away from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. And he'll blossom like the lily. He'll take root like the cedars of Lebanon. That's just one of the most beautiful things I've ever read in the Bible. There is a sense in which mankind is desperately twisted and lost, like Israel was at that time. You'll have to read the rest of Hosea to see the whole story, but then something switches. And God says, I'm no longer going to be angry with them. My presence amongst them is not going to be a presence of inescapable justice. It's going to be a presence like the dew, and they'll blossom and grow. That's God's intention, not just for Israel, but for all mankind. I mean, despite the issue of the inescapable judgment of the flood, God wants all mankind to come to know this gentle kindness he has, or he calls it like the dew, this unexpected precipitation that makes life go. That's what I want to be in your life. But if you choose, like the people in the flood, to stiff-arm God and say, God, I like this creation you've given me. I think I'll just keep with this, but I don't need you. I like this, but I don't need you. Then you're going to be dealing with the inescapable justice of God instead. That's our call throughout the entire Bible, is to highlight and make known the incredible loving kindness of God. And this is what he's trying to show us in the duality of rain. I can either, God says with this rain, flood and drown all mankind. Or if you embrace me and love me, want to know me, I can be like the incredible dew that comes down at night. I can be a great blessing to you. Let me show you a couple more. As we go into Matthew, Jesus uses this very thing in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, you've heard it said, you heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Oh, wow. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And you know what his justification for that is? The next verse. For he, God, causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain, the blessing of rain, on the righteous and the unrighteous. So God says, you got enemies? I do have enemies. I hate them with all my heart. You need to love them. What are you talking about? Well, you know, God loves them. You got to be kidding. Yeah. And as proof, Jesus says, does God withhold the rain on the lawns of the bad people and only rain on the lawns of the good people? No. Does God withhold the rains of the unjust farmers who are making a living by swindling people for the price of their produce and saying, no rain for you, you evil people, but then the good farmers, he brings rain? No. God decides in his general grace to give rain to both. So, if God is willing to love through the blessing of rain to the bad and the good, you need to be doing kind of the same thing. So you need to love your enemies. And why? Because rain's a sign of blessing. It's a sign of fertility. It's a sign of great giftedness when it's not merited at all. That's what he's saying. Let me give you another one. Paul and Barnabas are up in Lystra. And this is up in Acts. You can read about it in Acts, 14, 15, 14, right there. Paul and Barnabas are with this crowd in Lystra. And Paul says to them, listen, you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. In the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness. In that, he did good, and he gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. So as we move through the whole Old Testament and New Testament, rain has changed from being a symbol of inescapable justice to a sign of unmerited love and favor from God. Great blessing from God because of this. How can the same God be so judgmental and kill all mankind with raindrops and at the same time bless them with a few raindrops? because God is equally as just as he is loving. That's what he's trying to get across to us. He's just is equally just as he is loving. So this is what I want us to leave with us today. When it rains, you can either cower or you can say, yay, this is the blessing from God. And then you're talking about unmerited love. You understand that God gives to us even when we don't warrant it, when we don't earn it. Or you can be on the other side, because Proverbs says in Proverbs 19, the king's wrath is like the roaring of a lion. You don't want to be on that side. But his favor is like the dew on the grass, the gentlest of all rains, almost invisible where it comes from, and yet it nourishes. Or you can cower in the bushes and say, uh-oh, inescapable justice. Now, I leave that picture because that's pretty much all of mankind's reaction to God. He is either on the one hand, this vicious, nasty, capricious judge who's on our backs trying to say, don't do this, don't do this, or else I'll hurt you. Or we understand that he is this God of unmerited love and favor toward us. And when we come to know who he is through the face of who Christ is, we tend to move to the right side of this picture. If you don't know him, you're on that side. And like I say, almost every culture in the world understands that God is capable of bringing judgment on mankind because of their historical memory of the flood itself. And everyone who's on death's bed somehow has a pre-written understanding that very soon I'm going to have to be accountable for this life I just lived. Where does that come from? Why can't people just die and say, well, I'm going to die and I'm just going to evaporate? But there's something that nags at their heart, and they say, no, I get the sense that I'm going to be accountable to someone. Yeah. Is there a creator? If there was a creator, and I used all this place and all this health and all this breath and all this life, and I used all that for me, maybe I'm going to be accountable to him because he gave it to me. And in fact, that's again the message of the entire Bible, is that this place belongs to him for his purposes. That's why when we go back to Genesis 1, it's so important to get in our thinking that God made this place. Because if he made this place, he owns this place. And if he owns this place, then he has a purpose in creating this place. And if he has a purpose in creating this place, you better understand how you fit in that purpose. And as we understand, starting even in Genesis 2, that purpose is fellowship with man. It's to delight man with his presence, who he is. And that theme runs through the entire Bible. The entire Bible. But man said, I don't think so. And in doing that, he moved over to the left half of this picture. And now he understands that he's taken the good things from the giver of good things, but he's dissed the good guy himself. I'm happy with what you give me, but I'm not happy with your presence. And that fundamentally violates the purpose of creation itself. That's why we are indebted. Because we've stolen his life, but we haven't come back to him in fellowship. And that was his purpose in all of it. Okay, next week, what we're going to do is we're going to repopulate the world, and we're going to pick up in the middle of chapter 9, verse 18. The sons of Noah who came out from the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan, and these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So we're going to talk about how does that work, and why did he name the three sons, and who's Canaan? It's a big history. That's next week. So we're going to repopulate the world, and right after that we're going to have the Tower of Babel. Then we'll be done with all these 11 chapters of Genesis. But the whole point I want to leave with you is this idea. This same God who is in his gentleness and kindness gives us unmerited love, pictured in the coming of dew and rain, is the same God who can, with a snap of a finger, say, I can also flood you all out. So where are you going to be on this? There is inescapable justice. That's our God. There is unmerited love. That's our God. And Jesus came to say, God so loved this world, including us, that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him won't perish, but will have eternal life. Won't perish, but have eternal life. Yeah, Larry, you had a quick one? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So that's why Genesis is important. All mankind is sinners. From the point of the fall on, all mankind is sinners. We have rejected the Creator for his creation, it says. We preferred the creation over him, the good gifts instead of the good gift giver. And in that, we have created a debt against our Creator himself. Somehow that debt has to be paid. Somehow, something must die so that you'll live. And he's laying the strings of all these hints all through all mankind's history, and even written large in the nation of Israel to make it even more pronounced to all the nations. Something must die to cover your debt to the Creator. What will die? They'll cover it. And is God just a God of justice, or is he a God that you might want to know and be blessed by in knowing? And God has a promise that reoccurs all the way through the Old Testament and New. If you'll draw near to me, I'll draw near to you. You mean the Creator? Yeah. And then you can start to understand the manifold loving kindnesses of this God who with his dew and rain tells you every single day, you don't deserve this, but I'm giving it to you anyway. To this very day, every time that I see it start to rain, two things flash through my mind. And it did last night as well when it started to rain. The one is the coming of the wrath of God on mankind is close. I mean, he did it once before. He just let it rain for 40 days. He's going to do it a different way next time. But that rain reminds me, there is inescapable justice coming for those who haven't yielded their lives to this God. And we're going to read about that in 2 Peter in a couple weeks. And my heart just breaks for those that don't know. They don't get it. They don't understand that there really is this debt. But then when I hear the raindrops going, then another voice comes to my mind. And then I understand this dew on Israel, this gentle loving kindness, this Jesus saying, did I withhold the rain on the bad people? No. It's there for everybody. It's there for everybody. This gentle, merciful, unwarranted love of God. And when I hear the raindrops hit the ground, I go, there's the loving kindness of God. So every time you hear rain, remember, the inescapable justice could be right around the corner. But God, through the sign of his covenant, is not going to use water. But he is offering for anyone a drink of his water at no cost, if we'll just respond. And that's water. That's rain from God. Okay? Let's pray. Father, it does quicken my soul to think about the nearness of judgment. And Lord, we know from the flood that you can and you will bring ultimate justice. And that justice is couched in your love toward us. Because your love is so immense, you cannot abide injustice that harms the ones you love. The problem, Lord, is that we visit injustice on other people, and we ourselves are also culpable for that injustice. Lord, if you were to count sins, which one of us could stand? And the answer is none of us. And yet, there's the promise of that dew, the promise of that gentle rain, unmerited, unearned, that you bring to us to bring life in such a dry and such a desperate land that needs you. Lord, I pray that you would, through us, continue to communicate that there is hope, that there is a promise of life that persists, and that your return and the coming judgment and the inescapable justice that comes with that, your return is not just being slow or that you've forgotten, but because you're desirous that all would come to understand who you are and be saved. And Lord, may that passion and may that purpose permeate all that we are and all that we say. Indeed, your loving kindness to us never ceases. And your mercies are new every morning. Every morning. What faithfulness you have on our behalf. Thank you for being the dew in our lives. Unexpected and delightfully refreshing. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.